Something is about to be revealed that was never meant to be spoken aloud. A hidden bond, a spiritual chain tied deep in the unseen realm. She thought her finances were just bad luck, but it was something far darker. A river spirit, an agreement, and a life slowly drained for 15 years. What you are about to hear will shake your understanding of spiritual battles. And once you hear it, you cannot unhear it. It started with a confession that didn't sound like a confession at first. It sounded like exhaustion, like someone finally breaking under something they could no longer carry. She said, "I have worked hard my whole life, but money never stays." But what followed was not ordinary struggle. It was pattern. Repetition, a cycle she could not escape. Every time she received income, something would break. A debt would appear. A job would vanish. An opportunity would collapse at the final moment. And the most disturbing part, it always happened after she visited a specific river. Didn't connect it at first. People rarely do when spiritual chains are hidden inside familiar places. That river was part of her childhood, a place of memories, a place of comfort, a place she thought was harmless. But in the unseen realm, familiarity is often the doorway. She told me something chilling. Every time she went there, she would perform a small ritual she learned from an older woman in her family line. Nothing dramatic, nothing loud, just words whispered into the water, just offerings dropped silently into the current. She believed it was tradition, she believed it was cultural memory, but she never understood what she was agreeing to, because spiritual transactions do not require your understanding, only your participation. And that was the moment everything shifted. I asked her a simple question. When your finances began to fail, did it start after you began going there regularly? She froze. That silence said more than any words ever could, because deep down, she already knew. There are patterns that don't come from the physical world, patterns that repeat with intelligence, patterns that respond to location, timing, and agreement. This was not randomness, this was assignment. She began recalling something she had buried in her memory for years. A night when she was young, when she saw someone else at the river, a woman standing too still, speaking too softly, holding something wrapped in cloth. She never forgot that image, she just never understood it until now. Because in spiritual systems tied to water spirits, rivers are not just water. They are considered gateways, points of exchange, places where agreements are sealed through repetition. And every repeated act becomes reinforcement. The more she returned, the stronger the pattern became. At first, she thought her financial problems were normal life struggles, bills, job instability, things everyone goes through. But then the losses became specific. Money that was expected never arrived. Contracts were delayed until they collapsed. People who promised help suddenly disappeared without reason. It was not just delay, it was obstruction. And obstruction without cause always points to something deeper. She described something else that disturbed her even more. Every time she was about to receive a breakthrough, she would feel resistance before it even happened. A strange heaviness, a confusion in her thoughts, a sudden urge to cancel plans she once felt confident about. It was as if something was watching the timing of her success and interrupting it at the threshold. This is how spiritual cycles operate. They don't always destroy everything at once. Sometimes they delay everything just enough to exhaust your hope. And she had been living inside that delay for 15 years. 15 years of almost successful, almost stable, almost free, but never fully. When she said that number, her voice broke, because she finally understood the weight of repetition. I told her something she wasn't prepared to hear. That river was not just a place you visited. It became a point of agreement in your life. She looked at me like she wanted to reject it, but couldn't, because her life had already confirmed it. There are moments when truth does not need persuasion, only recognition. And she was recognizing everything: the missed opportunities, the financial instability, the invisible pattern that followed her like a shadow. But what came next was even deeper, because she admitted something she had never told anyone. She said, "Sometimes when I stood near the river, I felt like I wasn't alone. Not fear, not imagination, something else. A presence, subtle, unseen, but undeniable. And every time she ignored it, her life got worse. Every time she returned, the cycle tightened." That is when I told her the hardest truth. You were not just visiting a place, you were reinforcing a connection you never understood. Her face changed immediately, because she realized something terrifying. If repetition created the bond, then repetition also maintained it. And for 15 years, She had unknowingly maintained it. But I also told her something she didn't expect. Recognition is the first crack in every chain. Because once you see the pattern clearly, it stops being invisible. And what stops being invisible can begin to be broken, but only if you are willing to face what comes next. And what comes next is not just memory, it is confrontation with the source. She looked at me and whispered, "So what is it really?" And I told her, that answer is not simple, because some connections are not just symbolic, they are enforced. And what enforces them is still active. The moment she asked what is it really, the atmosphere in the room shifted. Not physically, but perceptibly. Like the weight of an unseen question had just been released into the space. Because once someone acknowledges a pattern, the next step is always confrontation with its structure. I told her something she wasn't ready to hear clearly. What you've been experiencing is not just misfortune repeating itself. It is maintenance of a spiritual contract through repeated access points. She went silent again, because deep down she already sensed that word contract fit too well, but she didn't understand how something like that could even form. So I began to break it down for her in a way she could actually process. There are systems in the unseen realm that operate through three things: access, agreement, and reinforcement. Access is where the connection begins. Agreement is where it becomes active. Reinforcement is what keeps it alive. And in her case, all three had been unknowingly present for years. That river was the access point. Her rituals, small, repeated, unexamined, were the agreement, and every return visit was reinforcement. She shook her head slowly, like she wanted to reject the idea, but something inside her wouldn't allow it anymore, because her life had already testified against her confusion. I asked her again, "When you stopped going for short periods of time, did you notice any change?" That question hit something deep. She admitted something crucial. Yes, when she stayed away for months, things slightly improved. Not fully, but noticeably. Then she would return during emotional stress and everything would collapse again. That was the cycle. Distance created relief. Return reactivated pressure. And she had unknowingly been looping between the two for 15 years. This is how long-term spiritual bondage often operates, not through constant attack, but through predictable cycles that feel like coincidence. But nothing about her pattern was coincidental. She described another detail that stood out. Whenever she was financially stable for even a short moment, she would feel a strange pull to visit the river again. Not a voice, not a command, just a strong internal urge, like nostalgia mixed with anxiety. It was emotional attachment. But in spiritual dynamics, repeated emotional pull toward a specific place is often a sign of active connection maintenance. Because the system doesn't always force you. Sometimes it invites you, and the invitation feels like your own thought. That is what makes it dangerous. She began to cry at that point. Not because she fully understood everything, but because pieces of her life were finally aligning into a single pattern. Broken finances, repeated cycles, emotional instability before losses, temporary recovery followed by sudden collapse. And the river sat at the center of all of it. I leaned forward and said something very direct to her. Whatever has been affecting your finances is not feeding on your effort. It is feeding on your repetition. That sentence changed everything in her expression, because she realized something painful. She had worked hard, she had tried, she had pushed through exhaustion for years. But effort alone does not break a reinforced system, especially when the system is sustained through behavior loops. She asked me quietly, "So I've been trapped without knowing?" And I answered honestly, not trapped in ignorance alone, but in participation without awareness. Because there is a difference between being attacked and unknowingly maintaining the conditions of the attack. That distinction matters. I told her to think about it like this. If someone builds a structure over time using repeated access to the same foundation point, the structure becomes stable through repetition. Remove the repetition and the structure weakens. But continue it unknowingly and it becomes stronger. That is what had happened to her life. 15 years of reinforcement had turned a small spiritual doorway into a long-standing cycle. She wiped her tears and asked the question everyone eventually asks in moments like this. Can it be stopped? And I didn't give her a dramatic answer. I gave her a truthful one. Yes, without breaking the pattern at its root. Because surface level change does nothing if the cycle is still being fed. She needed to understand something critical. You don't dismantle long-term cycles by wishing them away. You dismantle them by removing the behavior that sustains them. And for her, That meant facing the river differently than she ever had before, not as memory, not as comfort, but as the center of a repeating system she had participated in for years. She went quiet again, time not in denial but in reflection, because she was beginning to see the truth she had avoided for so long, that her struggle was not random, it was structured, and anything structured can be dismantled once you know how it was built. But the most important realization was still ahead, because understanding the structure is one thing, confronting what responds when you try to break it is another, and that is where the situation becomes far more serious. At this stage, her understanding had shifted, but understanding alone does not end the cycle, because some systems don't collapse when you recognize them. They react when you resist them. That is the part most people don't anticipate. She looked at me and asked something very direct. If I stop everything, will it leave me alone? And that question revealed where her fear still lived, because she was still thinking in terms of avoidance, not confrontation, not resolution. So I answered her honestly. Stopping the behavior removes reinforcement, but removal often triggers response. Her expression changed instantly, because she understood what that implied. When a long-standing pattern is interrupted, there is often a period of instability before things settle, not because the system is stronger, but because it is losing influence. I explained it further in simple terms so she could grasp the seriousness of it. Any system, physical or spiritual, that has been reinforced over years does not simply disappear quietly, weakens in stages. And during those stages, resistance often becomes noticeable. She asked me what kind of resistance, and I told her the truth as carefully as possible. Sudden emotional pressure, confusion without reason, dream disturbances, strong urges to return to old habits, even unexpected financial fear despite no real change in circumstances. She went quiet again, because she had experienced all of those before, especially during her short periods of distance from the river. That was the moment she realized something important. It was not random discomfort, it was reaction to separation, and that meant something very serious. Whatever this system was, it responded to detachment. I told her to pay attention to one specific detail in her history. Every time you decided to fully move away from that place, what happened within the next 2 weeks? She thought for a long time. Then she said something that changed the direction of the conversation completely. Every time she tried to move on completely, something unexpected happened financially. A sudden bill, a broken device, a lost opportunity, a family emergency, something that forced her attention back into survival mode. And survival always overrides intention. That is how cycles maintain themselves, not by force alone, but by interruption of focus. Because when your attention is redirected toward urgency, your old patterns regain access. She finally said it out loud. So every time I tried to leave it behind, pulled me back, and I responded carefully, not life, the pattern responding to your exit. There was silence after that, heavy silence, because she was beginning to understand something she had never considered before, that the system did not only affect her finances directly, it also affected her timing. It created interruptions precisely when she tried to break away, and that realization was devastating for her. She leaned forward and said, "Then how do people ever get out of something like this?" And I told her something very important. You don't win by reacting to resistance, you win by refusing to re-enter the cycle during resistance. That is where most people fail. They interpret pressure as failure, they interpret confusion as danger, and they return to what is familiar. But familiar is often the very mechanism of the cycle. I could see her processing this deeply now. For the first time, she wasn't just hearing information, she was mapping her entire life against it. Every setback, every delay, every financial collapse. And the river was still at the center of it all. She whispered, "I didn't know it would stay this long." And that was the most human moment she had expressed so far. Because 15 years is not just time, it becomes identity if left unchecked. But identity built through cycles can also be unbuilt through interruption. I told her something that shifted her focus again. The system only continues as long as access is repeatedly granted, even unconsciously. That statement brought her back into realization, because she understood now that physical distance was not enough if internal repetition still existed. Memory, emotion, habit, all of these can act as silent re-entry points. She asked, "So even thinking about it keeps it active?" And I answered carefully, "Thinking alone is not the issue. Returning mentally or physically to the same engagement pattern is." That distinction mattered, Because fear without clarity creates paralysis, but clarity creates direction. She was no longer in confusion, but she was standing at a critical threshold, because now she knew the truth of her situation. The cycle had structure, the structure had access points, and she had been part of those access points for years. What came next would determine whether she remained inside the pattern or finally stepped outside of it. And stepping outside of it would require something far more difficult than understanding. It would require sustained refusal in the face of pressure. At this point, there was no more confusion in her eyes, only confrontation with reality she could no longer unsee. And that is often the most dangerous moment in any long-term cycle. Not ignorance, awareness, because awareness demands action. She sat quietly for a long time before speaking again. So what happens if I never go back there again? That question wasn't curiosity anymore. It was fear testing the edges of change. And I answered her with full clarity. If you do not return to the access point, the reinforcement weakens over time. But the transition period is where pressure often peaks. She closed her eyes immediately because she understood what that meant. The system does not collapse instantly, it destabilizes. And instability feels like escalation to someone who has lived inside it for years. I told her the truth she needed to hear next. You may feel like things are getting worse before they get better. That is not proof of failure. It's proof of disconnection. That distinction was critical because many people interpret resistance as confirmation that they should return to old patterns. But in reality, resistance is often a sign that the cycle is losing its grip. She asked quietly, how long does it take for something like this to stop affecting my life? And I told her honestly, it depends on how deeply repetition was built. But what matters more is consistency in not re-entering it. Because cycles are not undone in moments. They are undone in sustained absence of participation. She nodded slowly, as if absorbing something heavier than she expected. Then she said something that revealed the emotional core of her struggle. I don't even want money in a complicated way, I just want peace. That statement shifted everything. Because beneath all financial struggle, the real issue was exhaustion. Not just lack of money, but lack of stability, lack of predictability, lack of rest. And that is what long-term cycles often steal first. I told her something very direct. Peace begins when repetition ends, not when circumstances immediately change. She understood that, because she had already lived through enough cycles to know that external change alone never lasted. But now she was being asked to change behavior at the root level. And that is where transformation begins. She asked one final question. If I break this, will everything I lost come back? And I answered carefully, return. Some may not. But what matters is that you stop losing from the same source again and again. That truth settled deeply in her, because she was no longer chasing recovery of the past. She was now focused on ending repetition of loss, and that is a completely different mindset. I told her one last important thing. There is no victory in returning to what drains you just to test if it still drains you. She looked down immediately, because she recognized how many times she had done exactly that in different areas of her life, not just the river, but relationships, patterns of emotional return. And that realization brought everything together. The river was not just a place, it was a symbol of a repeated pattern in her entire life. Return, loss, return again, a loop. And she had finally stepped outside of explanation and into recognition. She stood up slowly, as if carrying something invisible but heavy. And for the first time she said something different. I don't want to go back. That was the turning point. Not because fear disappeared, but because decision had formed, and decision is where cycles begin to break. Because no system survives consistent refusal forever, only inconsistent resistance. And she was no longer inconsistent in her awareness. She was finally seeing the full structure clearly. And clarity is what dismantles repetition. Not emotion, not panic, not sudden change, but sustained awareness followed by refusal. As she prepared to leave, I reminded her of one final truth. Your finances were never just about money. They were about patterns of return. Break the return and the pattern loses its anchor. She nodded once and walked away with something she had not carried in 15 years. A decision that was no longer divided. What you just witnessed is not just a story. It is a warning about cycles that hide in repetition. You are not powerless when patterns are revealed. You are only trapped as long as you return to what drains you. Every cycle breaks when refusal becomes consistent. Every chain weakens when access is denied. And every life changes when awareness turns into action.